All right, old school NBA fans, self-researched NBA facts. Got another video for you. As always, thanks to anybody who watches my videos, subscribes to my channel. I really appreciate it. I know the one yesterday definitely got some hate in there, and I don't mind if you guys disagree with me or, expand on a comment or something. That's all fine. The moment it gets personal, then you're blocked. That's simple. Because the way I look at it is that I don't ever go onto somebody's channel and get personal about any video they've made. In fact, I don't really comment on anybody's channels unless it's a positive comment, because that's just not my way. I mean, why bother doing that unless that's just who you are as a person? You know, you're a troll. You love to troll. That's your thing. I'm not. You know what I mean? Like I was born and raised well before the internet came out, so this whole trolling thing, I know there's an art to it. I don't know. I just use the tools that are available, the ones I know how to do, and use them accordingly. I don't bash other people's channels. I don't go on there. And if as soon as I see the title, if it's something I know I'm not going to agree with, I just don't even watch it. Why bother? You know what I mean? Just to get on there, it's irrelevant. But anyway. In this video here is something I'm going to talk about. I know the immediate pushback I'm going to get from it, and I'm going to cover that too. In this video, I'm going to talk about something, again, another angle I never hear anybody mention. I've never heard anybody bring this up. There's only been 7 times in NBA history that a team has beat multiple 60-win teams in the same playoff run. It's only happened 7 times. The first one was in 1973, the New York Knicks. They won the championship. They were 57-25. They beat the Boston Celtics, who were 68-14 in 7 games. Now, I know Havlicek had some injuries and whatnot, but they beat them nonetheless. And then in the finals, they beat the Lakers, who were 60-22 in 5 games. They retired Will Chamberlain, basically. That's what happened there. But they won 2 series against 60-win teams in the same run. The next time wasn't for 20 years, and that was the 1993 Chicago Bulls, who were 57-25 also. They beat the New York Knicks, who were 60-22 in 6 games. And they beat the Phoenix Suns, who were 62-20 in the finals in 6 games. They also won the championship. In 1995, the Houston Rockets were 47-35. The first round, they beat the Utah Jazz, who were 60-22 in 5 games. Then in the Western Conference Finals, they beat San Antonio, who were 62-20 in 6 games in the Western Conference Finals. The next time was the 96 Bulls, who were 72-10. They beat Orlando in the Eastern Conference Finals, who was 60-22, 4-0. And they beat the Seattle Supersonics in the finals, who were 64-18 in 6 games. The very next year, the Bulls did it again. They were 69-13. They beat the Miami Heat in the Eastern Conference Finals, who was 61-21. 4-1 in 5 games. And then they beat the Utah Jazz, who were 64-18 in the finals in 6 games. And they were red hot, too. Red hot. I think they were like 46-8 going into the finals. I mean, they were just on fire. That's why I laugh when people underestimate the Jazz and say they were overrated, a bunch of white guy, whatever. They were smashing everybody in the West in 97 and 98. Everybody. It didn't happen again for 9 years, but the 2006 Miami Heat, Dwayne Wade and Shaq on that team, they were 52-30, the second lowest record. I guess the 95 Rockets were 47-35, but 52-30 team, they beat Detroit. It was 64-18 in the Eastern Conference Finals in 6 games. And then they beat the Dallas Mavericks, who were 60-22 in the finals in 6 games. And all these teams won the championship. Now, here's the anomaly. The 2009 Orlando Magic, 59-23. They beat Boston in the Eastern Conference semifinals, who were Boston was 62-20. They beat them in 7. Now I know Garnett got hurt, and that turned everything. That's why Orlando won. Otherwise, they were not going to win that series. And then they beat Cleveland, who was 66-16 in the Eastern Conference Finals, for 4-2. And I just kind of did a video yesterday a little bit about that one. But had Orlando beat the Lakers in the finals, they would have been the only team to ever beat 3 60-win teams in the same run. Now, I understand there was injuries in there that helped them along, just like the 73 Knicks. It is what it is. But technically, that's the 7. That's it. That's all. 7 teams beat multiple 60-win teams in the same run. Now, I can already hear the detractors. Oh, well, it was done in the 90s 4 times because the league was so watered down, it was easier to rack up wins. Okay, let's take a look at that. So, in the 1960s, there was 97 teams. There was 97 teams total, an average of 9.7 teams per year, because they were expanding. The league started out with 8 teams and ended with, I think, 14 by the end of the decade. But there was 6 60-win teams in the whole decade. That's a lower number because, wasn't many teams. But the percentage is 6.18% of all the teams in the 60s won 60 or more games. In the 70s, there was 184 teams total, 18.4 teams per year. There was 9 60-win teams at a percentage of 4.89%. Okay, so percentage is all that really matters here. In the 1980s, there was 231 teams, 23.1 teams per year, because they had 2 expansions. There was 15 60-win teams, and they had a percentage of 6.49% were 60-win teams. So that's the highest we've seen. Now, the 1990s, there was 278 teams. So that would be in the whole decade. So that's 27.8 teams per year, because they had, multiple expansions, yada, yada. Now, it was 21 60-win teams in the 90s for a percentage of 7.55. So that's about 1% more than the 80s and about 1.5% more than the 60s. But in 1999, there was 2 teams that were only on pace to win 60 games. So they didn't actually win 60. So that's not even the same thing. So we're assuming that San Antonio and Utah Jazz were going to win 60 games. So technically, there was 19 teams in the 90s, and that would be a percentage of 6.83%, which is, 1/3% more than what the 80s had. So there wasn't really that many more. See what I'm saying? Percentage-wise, and that's what matters is the percentage. Now, in the 2000s, there was 295 teams. They had 1 expansion where Charlotte Bobcats came in halfway through the decade. I guess it was. I think it was like New Orleans, and then they moved around and blah, blah, blah. It ended up being the Charlotte Bobcats. But anyway, so out of the 295 teams, they had 15 60-win teams in the 2000s for a 5.08%. Okay? In the 2010s, there was 30 teams the whole time, 300 teams for the decade. There was 16 60-win teams, 5.33%. And then now in the 2020s, there's 150 teams in the 5 years, 30 teams per year. There's only been 5 60-win teams. 3.33%, the lowest of any decade, is the 2010. The 2020s is the lowest decade. The 70s, the second lowest. The 2000s, the third lowest. The 2010s, the fourth lowest. The 60s, the fifth lowest. The 80s, the sixth lowest. And the 90s, obviously were had the highest percentage, but it wasn't dramatic by any means. I mean, really, they only had 4 more 60-win teams than the 80s did, and they had 47 more teams in the decade. Now, here's what I want to get to. Now, the 1960s started out with 8 teams in the league, in the NBA. 6 teams. By the end of it, they had 14 teams by 1969, by the end of the decade. That's a 75% increase. The 1970s started with 14 teams, and the decade ended with 22 teams. Here's where it gets interesting, though. From 1968 to 1972, you also had 11 teams in the ABA. In 73 and 75, the 73 and 74, the NBA had 17 teams in the NBA, 10 in the ABA. That's as many as the 90s did, all the way up until 96, I guess. And then in 1975, there was 18 NBA teams and 10 ABA teams. That's 28. That's a lot of teams. And in 71, 72, there was 17 NBA, 11 ABA. So there's 28, 29 teams, 27, 28, 29 teams in the 70s. Nobody ever brings up that era for being watered down, though. No. The 70s started with 14 teams. The ABA folded. They merged. At the end of it was 22 teams. That's a 57.1% increase in teams. Okay, you go from essentially 14 to 22. Now, the 80s started with 22 teams in 1980. They had the Dallas Mavericks came in, I think it was 1981. In fact, it was. So that's one team. And then in 89, 2 more teams. So that's 3-team increase in the 80s for a 13.63 increase. Okay? The 90s started with 25 teams, ended with 29 teams. That's a 16% increase. That's not that big. And then, of course, the 2000s added the 1 team. It was only a 3.5% increase, going from 29 to 30 teams, blah, blah, blah. But the 90s had a 16% increase. That's not really that big. I mean, even if you include the 88-89 season that had an expansion team, that jumps it up to, 20%? The 60s had a 75% increase. The 70s, a 57% increase, and also had an ABA league running parallel with it in the early to mid-70s. So if you're going to talk about watered down eras, why is the late 60s and through the mid-70s never brought up for being watered down? Explain it. Tell me. That's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's prime. But we're not going to touch that one, are we? Because Kareem has to be great, because you want LeBron James to have a similar resume to Kareem about the longevity. That's what matters. So if all of a sudden Kareem seems watered down, not that great, blah, 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 well, he doesn't have as much credibility. Well, maybe LeBron doesn't have that much credibility. But anything to bring down Michael Jordan. But the fact is, it's marginal. The expansion teams, like I said, it was a 16% increase in the 90s, which really isn't that much considering the huge expansions that went on in the 60s and 70s. And the 80s expanded 3 teams. The 90s expanded 4 teams. What's the big whoop? You know what I'm saying? It was 1 more team than the 80s had. Nobody ever talks about the 80s being watered down. In 89, the first year there was expansion. You know how many 60-win teams there were in the league? 1. Detroit Pistons. That's it. 1990. Now you have 2 teams in 89 and 2 in 1990. How many 60-win teams were there in 1990? 1. The Lakers. That's it. There wasn't all these teams winning and winning and winning. Schedules were done a lot different in the 70s and 80s than they were in the 90s and on. In the 70s and 80s, you played teams in your conference 5 and 6 times each. And then you only played teams in the other conference twice. I mean, I guess that still goes on. But the point is, if you're one of these better teams, like you're the Philadelphia 76ers or the Boston Celtics in the early 80s, well, you're going to play these 30-win teams 5 and 6 times each. What's the difference if you play a 30-win team 6 times, or you play 2 or 3 different 30-win teams? Say you play two different 30-win teams, one's from each conference. You play this one 4, this one 2. Well, you still played a 30-win team 6 times. What's the difference? I don't understand that at all. How do you really rack up wins? All you do is when you have less teams, you condense your schedule. That's all you do. You can talk about the talent being watered down. That's fine. But it doesn't do anything to the win totals. That's all I'm saying. And at what point does it not become watered down? Because we've had 30 teams for 20 years now. So, we started out in, the 60s, 1960 had 8 teams. 1980 had 22 teams. So the league basically tripled in 20 years. So from 1980 to now, right now, that's 45 years. We've expanded or 81. In 44 years, we've expanded 9 teams. That's it. In 44 years. But from 1960 to 1981, we went from, or actually it was 23, I'm sorry. 1981, Dallas Mavericks expanded, making team number 23. So from 1960, there was 8 teams, okay? All the way to 1980, 20-year difference, they went from 8 to 22 teams. Actually, 23 if you want to count Dallas in 81. So from 1982 to now, they've given us 7 more teams in over 40 years. But yet, the late 60s and 70s are not watered down. It makes no sense to me at all. It's ridiculous. There was 2 teams in 89, 2 teams in 90, and 2 teams in 96. Yes, understandable. But at what point does it become watered down? So you start with 8, when you had 14, when you had 22, when you had the ABA running parallel to the NBA. When does it become watered down exactly? That's what I don't understand. And again, it has nothing to do with your win total. So anyway, that's all I got for this video. Thanks for watching. Until next time.